Global leaders are keeping an eye on St. Petersburg, Russia today. That's where Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a major address at a flagship economic forum. Just days ago, Ukrainian drone strikes rocked that host city of St. Petersburg. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy also published an open letter which taunted the Russian president about his age and called for face-to-face talks to end the war. Joining us now is NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons, who is at the summit in St. Petersburg. Keir, good to see you. What more did we hear from Russia's president today, and just how did he respond to this open letter from President Zelenskyy?
Well, not very happily, honestly. There was a representative for President Trump, a man called Rodney Cook, who was in the front row, and I spoke to him just before the address by President Putin, the question and answer session. I asked him about Ukraine. He said he was hopeful. Didn't sound very hopeful, though, when they got to asking President Putin about that letter from President Zelenskyy and about whether or not he would agree to what President Zelenskyy asked for, which was a face-to-face meeting. Take a listen.
What is this letter about? Is it a means to create an environment for a personal meeting, or maybe is letter meant to make sure that no personal meetings can take place at all? I think it's the second.
So I'll take that as a no, that you're not going to meet the author of the letter.
Пока не вижу смысла.
So far, I see no point.
The author of the letter, President Putin, in fact, doesn't even mention President Zelenskyy's name when he talks about him, and that was true again today. And he also, in comments, talked about his maximalist goals in Ukraine still being in place. Things like that Russia should take control of all of Donbass, something that Ukraine has said publicly it has ruled out, Joe.
Here, what else did President Putin say about current relations with the United States when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, what was fascinating was that he called on Rodney Cook, that representative of the Trump administration, friend of President Trump, to stand up and talk. And then Rodney Cook conveyed respects from President Trump to President Putin, and President Putin sent those back to President Trump. But ultimately, though, in another session here, we heard Rodney Cook say that there can't really be any kind of a reset, if you like, between the US and Russia, which is what many Russians are looking for, without peace. And I think he was saying that because that is what he was frankly told to say, because that's what the Trump administration now, I think, is settled on. And all of this really suggests that we aren't very much closer to any kind of a resolution. I will say there is a buzz here about the potential for another meeting with President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And in fact, I spoke to President Putin's envoy this week, and he said that he's in constant contact with them and that he does think that there will be progress, that he does believe that what was agreed in Alaska, according to the Russians, between President Trump and President Putin, will come to pass. But I think there are huge questions as we speak right now.
No doubt. Here, at the same time, I understand the Russian Ministry of Defense said there has been another prisoner exchange between Ukraine and Russia. What do we know?
Yeah, that's right. Another prisoner exchange, a substantial number. And then at the same time, and this is the irony, this is the contradictions of this whole thing, really. At the same time, just today, there were more drones targeting Moscow. And of course, this speech by President Putin here came after that drone attack on St. Petersburg. And in fact, President Putin, in his address today, accepted that drones had hit a particular facility. So it's kind of push and pull. But in the end, the fundamental thing is that the person who will really decide was standing on the stage today. That is President Putin. And he doesn't really seem to have moved very far, in fact, frankly, not at all, from the position he's been taking for years, if not months.
Keir Simmons in St. Petersburg. Keir, thank you so much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.